I'm getting better because like a solid 6 out of 20 times I can get it to work just right. Well, today we are going to be looking at, we're going to be backing up and moving forward both at the same time.
Cool.
We've been talking about regionalism in both the United States and in Mexico. And we were looking at a couple other things like abstract expressionism. We touched on that just a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Abstract expressionism really hit its heyday significantly after World War II throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. And then it reemerged later on. But what we're looking at is just immediately after the end of World War II. So I wanted to touch on some of the history, and I was going to ask if anybody remembers, but I'm pretty sure none of us have that long of a memory. So if you guys don't mind, how are you doing, Joey?
Hey. Sorry, my computer wigged out.
So we're looking at color field and new art, essentially. And this is an important video to watch. It talks about what happened in European recovery right after World War II, but I want to focus on a lot of the art as much as we can. And but I do want to touch on a couple videos. Let's see, I'm going to try to, or I'm sorry, I'm going to see. There we go. I'm going to see if I can find a short video to look at. All right, this will be good. This is a 3-minute one. And it's just to give a little bit of context. Of course, world wars have been going on for a long time. Before World War I and II, there was the Crimean that involved a lot of different areas. And then before that, it was the Crusades. I mean, they involved a lot of communities. There's always a huge suck factor when during wars. And then it's interesting to me that afterwards, a lot of a culture's energy goes into creating an environment where peace can be sustainable. And I just think that that's really fascinating. I mean, that's how we get, after the 200 years of the Crusades, that's how we get kind of one of the huge elements that led directly into the Renaissance. And that does happen, it seems, quite a bit. And it's just interesting to me that when people get sick and tired of war, they'll go to peacetime. And this short video just talks a little bit about the end of World War II and kind of provides a landscape for the artwork that we're going to be moving into. And again, for people that are watching this after the fact, if you guys can't see this on the YouTube recording, it's because of somebody's copyright something or another.
Hi everybody, today we're going to have a little look at what the main consequences of World War II were. If you see this word consequences, it means the same thing as impact or results. Firstly, we're going to look at some of the immediate consequences of World War II. Deaths and injuries. The Axis powers had about 5.1 million civilian casualties, while the Allied powers had about 25.4 million civilian casualties. The Axis.
Okay, and just what that means is that Germany and her allies, people that were not fighting, 5 million people died, and all the countries that were going against Germany and Japan and Italy, all the innocent people there was about 5 times the volume. And I think that speaks a little bit to the targeting of the people that were in charge of the military action.
powers had 5.9 million military casualties, while the Allied powers had 18.6 million military casualties. Destruction and economic revival was another consequence of World War II. Cities, roads, railways, and harbors throughout Europe were destroyed. America used Marshall aid to help European governments to rebuild. World War II created a huge number of refugees. By 1950, 11.5 million Germans had left Eastern Europe. Many Jews leaving concentration camps found that their homes had been taken, and so they had to live in camps before emigration to countries like Israel and the United States. After World War II, 2 million Poles had to leave Soviet-occupied territory. The Nuremberg war trials put leading Nazis like Göring and Ribbentrop on trial. 12 of these Nazis were sentenced to death, 3 were given life sentences, and 3 were acquitted. World War II also had a series of long-term consequences. The first of these was the division of Germany. After World War II, Germany was initially split into 4 occupied sectors before being split into the GDR and the DDR, so East and West Germany. Germany remained divided like this until the 3rd of October 1990. After World War II, Japan was occupied by US forces until 1952. Following the US withdrawal, they still maintained military bases in Japan. After World War II, the USA and the USSR emerged as superpowers. Their conflicting ideologies led to the Cold War. The USA worked to contain communism, while the USSR installed communist governments across Eastern Europe. World War II meant an end to European supremacy. Britain and France were no longer strong enough to hold on to their empires, and between the 1940s and 1960s, their empires were decolonized. In the aftermath of World War II, there was a move towards European unity. European leaders promoted European unity, and this eventually led to the formation of the European Union. Because the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, a new organization called the United Nations was set up. Both the USA and the USSR joined. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful.
So a very brief overview of the aftermath of World War II. It's interesting to me that the Allies lost between 3 and 5 times as much manpower as the Axis powers, or Germany, Japan, and Italy. And the Marshall Plan was when the U.S. provided an awful lot of financial aid to spearhead aid from the traditional allies to rebuild the countries that had been devastated during World War II, primarily the people that had been enemies just a little while before. You know, or not the people, but the country that have been enemies. I think that's interesting because World War II, a big argument can be made that it happened because of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, where France spearheaded an effort to completely destroy and cripple the economy of the people that they thought had started World War I. And I just think it's an interesting take on that. And very quickly, West Germany became one of the most rapidly expanding economies in Europe. And Japan, I mean, they created Godzilla. I mean, how cool is that? It's pretty amazing. And so a big part of that is going to be the U.S. supporting them to rebuild their country. Of course, they had to keep rebuilding after every time Godzilla got pissed off at Tokyo, but still. So what we're looking at, the art world at this time is specifically dealing with the aftermath of an awful lot of devastation and dealing with a lot of rebuilding. We already talked about abstract expressionism, I think, fitting really well into the environment of the Cold War and the threat of the nuclear bomb. The other stuff that we're looking at seems to me to be how different people reacted to just the entire aftermath of World War II outside of this kind of awareness of, or in addition to the awareness of the Cold War. I think even though it is just anecdotal, I think we can see that a lot of the times people and communities will respond in very different ways to very similar environments. Like, like we talked about during wartime, musicians are going to be composing marches and they're also going to be composing love ballads. And it's both the same kind of thing. I've been watching the 90s series Sharp's Rifles with Sean Bean. Very, very awesome. And this is something where, people will have all the drum beats getting into war, and as they're marching towards war, people are singing love songs about people at home that they miss. It's just really kind of interesting. One thing that I noticed looking at the artwork that we're looking at is it seems to me that there is an awful lot of energy put into trying to find I don't know, balance or kind of a cognitive security. I'm mentioning this now because I want you to just see if you can find what I'm seeing as well. Because even though they're addressing a lot of very similar things to what people were doing at the very first start of the century, as well as between World War I and II, it seems like they're really targeting these ideas of balance and rationality, finding what the center is, kind of thing. And it seems that art in general and these movements that we're looking at outside of abstract expressionism are almost exploring ideas of meditation and centering. And that may be entirely just my bias, but I want you to look at it and see what you think. So there is a significant and palpable change after World War II with art. And I'm trying to get, okay, here we go. Hold on a second, technical expert on the way. Okay, here we go. The things we're looking at are color field painting, the new sculpture movement, and then also women artists and in the post-World War II era are three of the things that we're looking at. And color field painting is odd enough that I think it deserves its own video. And I thought this was pretty good. This person is talking about both minimalism and color field. Minimalism really kicked into high gear, and it seems to be like a reaction to abstract expressionism, but it seems to revisit a lot of the ideas of color field painting. And what's interesting between these two things, you also get the Korean War and the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, which I think is really kind of fascinating. So again, there's these nationally involved wars. Color field painting deals with exactly what it sounds like. It is basically painting made up with fields of color. And I think if you remember some of the landscapes that Georgia O'Keeffe have been doing, where she's simplifying a landscape and using essentially fields of color to do that. The difference is that with a color field painting, it is a lot less about easily identifiable content and more about just exploring the power of the colors itself. And some of the artists we're going to be looking at, of course, are Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman. We're going to look at Helen Frankenthaler again, who particularly, she was a big abstract expressionist, but she was also very much involved in color field painting. And there's some interesting images. They're showing Helen Frank. This is kind of her style of color field painting. And if you remember some of the stuff that we saw with abstract expressionism, there's a very specific difference. Can you sense the difference between this and stuff that even Lee Krasner had been doing? You know, you don't have the frenetic energy of Jackson Pollock or Lee Krasner. It feels a lot more sedate. This reminds me quite a bit of that kind of calm that was present in a lot of Georgia O'Keeffe's stuff. Which I think is absolutely amazing. And of course, I just lost all my links. Hold on just a second here. Nobody panic. All right, here we go. Sorry about the delay there. A little bit of not technical difficulty, but I'm going to pretend it's technical difficulty anyway. It's user interface error. So color field painting is one of these new things that shows up. And you can kind of see it echoed from earlier, the Fauvist stuff and some of the Cubist collages. But it is its own thing, and it's its own thing after World War II. And the New Sculpture movement refers to the period of sculpture that was between 1948 and mid-1950s. Again, you know, beginning with a new approach or reapproaching sculpture. Some of the other stuff that we looked at included dynamic forms through space, that bronze person running from the Italian Futurists. And we see some other stuff, but I think what people started doing at this time is really interesting. And then we also get other post-World War II art that we'll look at. So I want to share some videos about, there's 3 short videos that I want you to watch, and we'll just watch one, and then I want to share with you the different artists. Okay, so here we go.
The origins of color field. Color field painting came about as a result of different independent attempts by Clifford Steele and Rothko during the late 1940s to create sort of an eternal form of art, which might transcend the ethical collapse triggered by the chaos and carnage of World War II, a type of painting that would speak for itself. We're getting at some of those existential ideas once again. They're reacting to the war and the chaos, and how could humans do this to each other?
Does anybody remember what existential means? It deals with philosophy and thought revolving around the idea of what does it mean to be or to exist, and that's where the word comes from. And during this time, this is also when people start developing introspective poetry that functions in the West in a very similar manner to the Buddhist reversions of traditional Buddhist monks in China and Japan, where the poetry is not intended necessarily to make sense. It's not meant to be nonsense like the Dada poets, but it is meant to be internally reflective and deal with those questions about what existence is. And this, of course, turns into late 50s and early 60s the beatniks, which most of us on the faculty here at Utah Tech kind of consider ourselves resurrected beatniks. Maybe not. Maybe I'm the only one.
each other, and they're trying to create something universal. They rejected all forms of representation or figuration. They also avoided the gestural abstract expressionist ideas of de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, even though the latter's action paintings can be seen as a pioneering attempt to create an overall field of color. The emergence of color field effectively divided abstract expressionism into these two styles: gestural, which
I really like this image because it shows very much the difference. You know, this is a Jackson Pollock. He was one of his nicknames was Jack the Dripper, and this is a Mark Rothko. Now, why do you think the Mark Rothko is called a color field painting?
Would it have
Andrew?
anything to do with the field of color?
Yeah, this is one of those rare cases where the title actually matches what you see. And that's how all these guys were. I mean, they each of the artists that we'll look at have a different, distinct and different take on it. But what they're exploring is what the colors feel like. You know, just this field of color. And this is something that I know we've talked a little bit about before, where sometimes a little bit is nice, more becomes interesting, and a lot becomes powerful. And so when you look at a Mark Rothko painting, and some of these are 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, they're big. You get lost in the field. And some of them, people think that they are supposed to be landscapes, but if there's any sort of reference point in the real world, it doesn't make any difference. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the emotion that's developed through this expansive color.
which we dealt with Jackson Pollock, and large, smooth, flat, incident-free fields of rich color, which we will see from chromatic abstraction or color field painting. Exponents of this latter style of color field painting, like Still and Rothko, will devote more attention to formal elements of their painting, such as line, shape, and color. They're not going to worry about secondary elements such as context or narrative, and this emphasis on the formal was strongly supported by the highly influential art critic Clement Greenberg, the same one who turned up in abstract expressionism, pushing those ideas, making it well known. Now, Greenberg's support guaranteed the style widespread attention and approval because he was sort of a thought leader of the time. He's the kind of art critic that everyone reads, and if he approves of your art, then, well, everyone else will too. So they're using these very formal compositional ideas and ignoring the narrative, ignoring the illustrative, to create these much more basic, much more subtle forms. Now we have to
Sorry about that. Clement Greenberg is one of these people. He was an art critic that gave Cubism its name. He said it just looked like Picasso had stacked cubes and then painted them. Clement Greenberg is one of these art critics that really kind of defined popularity of art movements, popularity of individual artists. He could make or break an artist with an article, because what he said, collectors responded to. Post-World War II, there is a significant amount of money in families who supplied armaments and support materials for the war. So there is a lot of money to be had by collectors. And somebody like Clement Greenberg could say something, and overnight, a young kid who peed in somebody's fireplace would become an international sensation, which is exactly what happened to Jackson Pollock. And I mean, the first real big art show he went to was in somebody's home. There was a big fireplace, and he walked over and peed in the fireplace because he was a little tipsy. And because Clement Greenberg loved this stuff, he became an international superstar, which I think is absurd. But this class is about art and not art criticism. So anyway, stuff like that just makes me wonder. Anyway, so I want to share, I picked about 4 or 5 artists that I thought, and I like them because each of them addressed this idea of color field very differently. So there's 5 of these. And the first one is Mark Rothko. And I wanted to share, this is what his paintings look like. I mean, these are like 4 or 5 feet across. These are not tiny things. They might even be a little bit bigger than, well, a lot of them are bigger than that. But essentially, there's 3 or 4 elements in each one. The most common are an upper and lower space, sometimes with a middle part, and then this border that you see. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to expand this so we can get a little bit. Okay, here we go. So there's not an awful lot going on story-wise. There's nothing going on story-wise. This is not intended to be a landscape. We looked at, earlier we looked at Eugene Steele or Pete Mondrian's work, and his stuff was, a lot of it was based on landscape ideas. But Mark Rothko, that was not of any interest at all. It's formal because it's meant to be an exploration simply of color and form without any sort of narrative components to it. So he uses orange on a light brown background because he wants you to, or he wants to just share the orange. And it's kind of, which is, I don't know, that seems kind of weird, but if we think of this art, color field painting, as a meditative exploration by people dealing with the aftermath of World War II, it starts to make a little bit more sense, I think. Do you guys get that? Do you guys buying what I'm shelling out? But you know, I can see these as meditative studies, and so they are specifically different than other things previously that seem to deal with strong elements of color, like some of the Impressionists dealt with very strong and powerful fields of color. You know, like big blue swaths with lily ponds and stuff like that. But there was always some sort of context to it, or need for something, you know, need to communicate something. And it seems like with the birth of the color field, they're just meditative studies. And I think it's fascinating. We're not going to do this with each of them, but I really like the smart history stuff. And so I wanted to share this, which is 2 art historians talking about a Mark Rothko piece, just applying those 4 tools of artistic critique in a particular way to gain more appreciation. So, and another thing I want to point out that is completely an aside, artists have a tendency, especially when they want people to be impressed with their levels of thought, to give nonsensical titles to their work. I think Jeff Koons is one of the best at this because he will say untitled and then in parentheses give the title. And Mark Rothko will number these things and sometimes give them multiple numbers. So I don't know if the number refers to the painting or the fields of color.
We're in the galleries at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. I'm seeing this beautiful, luminous Mark Rothko. It's number 210, number 211, orange, and it dates to 1960.
It is hard for me to verbalize my relationship with this painting. It just makes me want to be quiet. It surrounds me, even though it is a flat plane where these orange rectangles and squares hover and vibrate against this lavendery but dark purple field. It makes my whole body feel like it's vibrating.
Quiet, contemplative is exactly how I feel. It almost feels like an intrusion that we're speaking in front of the painting. There's something about the horizontals of the forms that make everything feel as if they're moving ever so slowly, almost the way the clouds form and unform. And the way in which those forms fill the space, but then push out forward and then recede also simultaneously back into the pictorial space is slow and gentle and densely aesthetic.
How can something painted it so flatly, though we see a lot of brushstrokes in it, it creates this deep illusionistic space.
It really seems to be basically two colors, and yet each of those colors are seen infinitely modulated. There are so many yellows and oranges within those spaces, and then even the purple that functions both as a space that the orange can occupy, but then somehow also as a frame. It's got an infinite set of variations.
Rothko, by the time he painted this in 1960, had been painting abstractly for 20 years. And yet in that practice, there are similarities, but no picture is the same. And in this particular one, you see these shifting shapes. And there are places where the orange is more densely painted and other places where it's really thin, so that because it is painted entirely purple underneath, that you also get this sense of a veil.
It's really instructive to look at the decisions that Rothko made, and I find especially intriguing the edges of the orange, the way in which they feather, and the complexity of the relationship that he draws between the purple and the orange. This idea that pure color and pure form could resonate in a way that was spiritual, that was profound, was central to some of the thinking of the abstract expressionists, and I think especially important to Rothko. The idea that this was a painting that would elicit deep human emotion.
In the mid-20th century, there is less conversation around spirituality in art. And Rothko was, throughout his career, concerned with thinking about painting and its relationship to the spiritual, and not being connected to any kind of specific religious dogma, but rather that much larger idea about there being something larger than us, and where do we, or how do we stand in relationship to it.
This is painting that develops in the post-war era at a moment when society had some fundamental questions in front of it. This was the aftermath of the Holocaust. This was the aftermath of atomic weaponry. This is a moment when important philosophical questions are being asked, and Rothko is confronting those, but he's not using the visual vocabulary of a past era. He's not showing angels. He's thinking about how is it possible to touch the spiritual in our modern age.
And thinking about the year of this painting, 1960. This is a fiery orange painting, and this is just as the civil rights movement and so much activism was literally catching fire. And I think that we can't ignore that combination and its possibilities of being on Rothko's mind.
So this is a spiritual and transcendent painting, but it is very much a product of this moment.
I just think that that's really fascinating. There's two things I want you to take away from that conversation. One is the idea of the veil, which keeps showing up in color field painting, and the other is the idea of spirituality, and which is something that we don't talk an awful lot about with art, because we've been trained to consider art as a product. But there is this element of non-dogmatic spirituality, I think, that keeps showing up, particularly with the color field painters. And I want to share, Helen Frankenthaler is a woman that I think is absolutely fascinating, because like with many artists, she straddles several different movements. But what's fascinating to me is that she's a master in each of the movements that she touches on, which I think is just fascinating. So here are two examples of her color field paintings, and then here's an example of her abstract expressionism right in the center. You know, looking at some of her work, and here's another example of one of her color field paintings. We can say, oh, you know, yeah, this is just an expanse of blue. But one of the things that Mark Rothko was doing is, instead of just spray painting a flat color onto something, he gave it depth by layering several different colors and allowing us to see the brush strokes and the density, the thinness of everything. And Helen Frankenthaler approaches her color field differently, but there are some really strong similarities too. Like, one is there's this powerful broad field of blue. Another is she has these lines, these kind of organic horizontal lines going through that breaks up the space. So and she's also using colors that almost complement each other. You know, and for here directly, she has orange and blue, which are direct complements. And then she has some other things too, like a paler blue, an indigo, and other colors that just kind of break up the broad expanse of the field. But in addition to all that, what do you notice about this broad blue field? It's not flat. There's depth to it because she is layering paint on. And with some of these painters, you'll see the drips of paint. With others, you'll see specific brushstroke patterns or just creation marks. And with her, we get this kind of almost watercolor type effect in the background with the way that the blue is light and dark, which I think is fascinating. So this is just one example. This is a more recent one. And then these are ones that were done earlier, where we still have the fields of color, but here the shapes are quite a bit more organic, for one thing. And we also see a layering of color that is not flat or static, which I think is really interesting. I don't think these don't read to me as if it's important that we see these as specific shapes, or even as we see these as believable dimensional forms. I do think it's important, though, that to the artist that we see these as made shapes, that we see the process of construction in them, and with the variation layers of color and density of color, I think that's on the part of the artist, that's a way to make these areas more interesting to us, just to look at, just to explore. So it's not meant to be a thing at all. It's meant more to give you something to look at while you're thinking, I think. What do you guys think?
Jump in if you don't mind.
Oh, go ahead, Joey.
Sorry, it's good timing. Yeah, I don't know. I can't help but think of some of the previous artists that I've stumbled into because of this class. Joseph Albers comes to mind, who was doing a lot of work in color theory from the Bauhaus, but his
Right.
work very similar to color field, right? And just the way that the colors interact with each other. And then I also keep thinking of what's her name, Hilma af Klimt.
Yeah, her stuff is amazing.
Yeah. Because that gets into the sort of the mystical spirit, side of the almost like ecstatic spiritual elements.
Right. Yeah. And I class earlier this week, I compared Hilma's work to Hildegard von Bingen, the paintings that she did from her visions. Because there seems to be that element of spirituality. And it's fascinating that you bring up Bauhaus because, of course, at what time period did the Bauhaus start? Right after World War I.
Yeah.
They're doing something very similar with very similar visual vocabularies. And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, this is one of my all-time superheroes, and we are going to watch the video about this guy. I think he is absolutely amazing. Barnett Newman. Now, there is a very strong similarity between him and Mark Rothko, and a very specific difference. The similarity is big areas of color. They're all the same color. And the big difference is you don't see as much energy given to the individual strokes. And he also he has his awareness at right angles to where Mark Rothko does. But it's fascinating to me that his work, looking the way it does, you do have some significant color variation, but these paintings are gigantic. I mean, remember how big those paintings by Mark Rothko were, 4 to 5 feet or so across. These are about 6 feet tall and anywhere from 12 to 18 feet across. So they are gigantic, and they're meant to give you an entire atmosphere instead of just a thing to look at. And I wanted to share a video about him talking about his stuff, but I want to show some of these other paintings to you. So this is the one we were looking at right there. This I think is really fascinating because it's almost an entirely flat field of ivory with just this darker ivory vertical stripe. Sometimes the colors are barely different from each other, like these two, and some of the times the colors are very strongly different. And I just think it's really, really interesting. So let me share this video with you. One of the things I love about this time period too is that several of the artists involved lived long enough for people to record them talking about their own work. And Marcel Duchamp kind of ridiculing his own work on a live interview, I thought was just really a treasure, because you listen to him talk about his own stuff, and it's kind of funny to me that so many critics at the time were so serious, one way or another. They either thought he was like the second coming of an amazing prophet, or he was, you know, a world ender. They thought he was terrible, and he just thought it was hilarious because what he wanted was people to react. So I really think that this is a very cool time period. Anyway, here we go.
I felt the issue in those years was, what can a painter do? The problem of the subject became very clear to me as the crucial thing in painting. Not the technique, not the plasticity, not the look, not the surface. None of those things meant that much. Those things, I suppose, could find their way. But the issue for me, and I think it existed for all the fellows that, you know, for Pollock, and for Gottlieb, and what are we going to paint? I think the best distinction has been made by Professor Maya Shapiro, who, in talking about subject in painting, has made a distinction between what he calls the object matter. For example, people think that Cézanne's subject are the apples. Well, it's possible to argue that that's what it is. And for a long time, I was very antagonistic to those apples, because they were like super apples. They were like cannonballs. I saw them as cannonballs. But he does talk about but Maya, in making the distinction between the subject of a work and the objects in the work, I think makes a remarkable distinction that should help people understand that even though, let's say, my painting as it developed did not have any of those objects, that it did not necessarily mean, therefore, that there was no subject there. My first painting there, where I felt I had moved into an area for myself that was completely me, I painted on my birthday in 1948. And it's, you know, it's a small red painting, and I put a piece of tape in the middle, and I put my so-called zip, which I prefer to call, actually, it's not a stripe. Now, the thing I would like to say about that is that I did not decide, either in 48 or in 47 or in 46 or whatever it was, to say to myself, I'm going to paint stripes. I did not take an arbitrary, abstract decision. I suppose I thought of them as streaks of light. When I painted this painting, which I called Wonderment, I stayed with that painting for about 8, 9 months, wondering to myself, what had I done? What was it? And I realized that up until then, whenever I used that attitude, I was filling the canvas in order to make that thing very, very viable. And suddenly, in this particular painting moment, I realized that I had filled the surface. It was full. In that painting, I got rid of atmosphere. That stroke made the thing come to life. I feel that my zip does not divide my painting. I feel it does the exact opposite. It does not cut the format in half or in whatever parts, that it unites the thing. It creates a totality. As you see it, you look at it and you see it. And if you don't, there's nothing to walk into. It's not a window leading you into a situation where you walk through some either interior or exterior world from which you then come to a conclusion. The beginning and the end are there at once. Otherwise, a painter is a kind of choreographer of space. He creates kind of a dance of elements, of forms. And it becomes you might say, either a tactile art or it becomes a narrative art instead of a visual art. When you see a person, you have an immediate impact. You don't have to really start looking at details. Your first reaction when you meet a person for the first time is immediate. And it's a total reaction in which the entire personality of the person and your own personality make contact. And to my mind, that's almost a metaphysical event. If you have to start examining the eyelashes and all that sort of thing, it becomes a cosmetic situation in which you remove yourself from the experience. There's more to the problem, it seems to me, than any old-fashioned idea of what an easel painting is. A painting can be bigger than anything that can go on an easel and still be, in my opinion, an easel painting. And in the end, size doesn't count. Whether the easel painting is small or big is not the issue. Size doesn't count. It's scale that counts. It's human scale that counts. And the only way you can achieve human scale is by the content.
I love this quote. Since I'm a sculptor, that is one of my favorite quotes ever. Sculpture is what you back into when you look at a painting. But he also wrote a little bit. He had been asked several times about his paintings and what some of the words that we see or that we heard in that little interview. One of the words was metaphysical. So he's dealing with the same kind of spiritual issues that Rothko was working with. He's dealing with that kind of extra dogmatic or non-religious spirituality. And one of the things he says about his own paintings, which I thought was really interesting, is that these zips, they're not stripes, they're called zips. They represent the moment of contact between an individual down here and something beyond that, like representing maybe the divine. It's a moment of inspiration. And I think if that's what he feels about, then these start making an awful lot of sense. Rather than cutting the painting into three parts, the color field becomes an atmosphere to support this moment of inspiration, which I think is absolutely astounding. What do you guys think? Do you think that's a bunch of crap, or does that sound plausible? Did somebody raise their hand?
I did. I was just thinking You know, I've never thought about these paintings in that context, you know. Um, I don't know. It's kind of opened my eyes to a different way of thinking about them. So I appreciate them a little more than previously.
Well, that's good. It is interesting to me that these are showing up from several different people in several different areas, but they all seem to be addressing very similar reactions to the same world event, World War II. And I think that that's one of the things that really, for me, unites these color field painters in as a movement. It's a shared response to something. One of the founders of color field was Clifford Still, and I want to show some of his paintings. And I think you'll be able to see the same kind of thing showing up. There's these previous three that we saw, and then what Clifford Still is doing is very similar too. So this is one of his color field paintings. It's called PH4. Again, I don't understand what the point of the titles are, but it doesn't matter. And what's interesting to me is that his take on this is, again, very different from what other people are doing. This kind of reminds me a little bit more of Helen Frankenthaler's perspective. And it's fascinating to me because the content of the painting is just fields of color. Again, that's all we're dealing with. And as we look at them, we can look at them a little bit closer. Like Helen Frankenthaler, he is layering down several different kinds of color to give a field of blue, for example, that is not just flat. It's not emotionless. There's something there. And even in this field of purple, there's a different kind of blue in it. And there's this stuff going on that, again, for me, it doesn't feel like it is designed to connect with any actual object. It's not designed to be something. It's designed to provide an environment for you to think. And I think that's really interesting. And some of these will have these lines, almost like Cezanne-like lines. But it is interesting to me that most of them are just, this one is probably the closest to being narrative of all of them. Looks to me like this is a cityscape. That seems to be relatively obvious to me. But the others that we're seeing look to me as if they are just explorations and meditations on what color does. And then when we see more of these, they feel less like cityscapes and they remind me more of Barnett Newman's Zips, because these things that we can read as skyscrapers seem more and more to be non-objective placements in the painting. Are you guys seeing this at all? Let's see, and I want to share this really quick. We're not going to listen to the person at all. I just want to look at some of the work. So this is something from an exhibit of his work, and it's interesting to see like the size of these paintings. These are about 4x5 or so similar in size to Mark Rothko. And here, this reminds me quite a bit, like Joey was referencing earlier, of the Bauhaus. That reminds me of that quite a bit. And here, these make me think of what Helen Frankenthaler was doing a little bit with the shapes of color field. These feel more like very solid color field paintings, fitting very strongly in there. And you can see it's almost like he's layering or spackling the paint down and giving it a physicality that a lot of painters don't do, because a lot of the texture that they give is in the shades of the paint itself. And I think some of these, so this one particularly makes me think of Helen Frankenthaler's work and Barnett Newman's work, because this kind of reminds me of the zip, where you have that strong, thin line that the white field seems to be supporting, as opposed to having it act as a divider between these two fields of white. And then we get these organic shapes like what Helen Frankenthaler was working with. I think that's really interesting. So this is done right at the tail end of World War II. One of the things that I think is fascinating about most of these color field painters is the layering of color in such a way so that the fields almost feel diaphanous. I mean, it looks like instead of a field of gray, we're seeing one of the other colors through a thin veil of the other color. And I think that's really interesting. Can you guys see the texture in this field of yellow? It looks like paint over oil pastels almost that are just really ground in. And I think that this is just absolutely fascinating. There is no, I don't really feel like this is an abstraction from a landscape at all. I feel that it's more just an exploration of what the colors, the shape the colors want to be in. You see, just in this field of red, I count 5 different distinct shades of red, just being layered on top of each other. But you stand back and it almost reads as a solid thing. What are you guys' take on that painting?
Jump in here. I think it's lovely. I like all these close-up shots that show the texture. In my experience, these paintings are really difficult to look at on a flat screen. You like really need to be in front of them, So
Right.
I like seeing that texture because it sort of helps me visualize how the painting reads. But yeah.
I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Andrew, I was looking at that, how he used a little bit of the contrast in colors as well with the reds and the yellows, and how it was almost overtaking the red with the yellow, but they were meshing together and they had different portions of it that were incorporated in both of the colors and the shapes. That was interesting how he put those two together.
Yeah, it feels less like they're competing and more like they're living beside each other, kind of. It's hard to describe, but when you think of color use and complementary color, a lot of the times people will do that to separate fields, and this doesn't feel quite like that to me. It feels like they're kind of melting into each other almost, and I love that. But even though it doesn't, we're not talking about the exact same things, it does feel that this is another meditative exploration on the numinous, the thing that's just off the tip of your tongue, something you can't quite give a narration to or solid concrete language to. And it feels to me like he's dealing with very similar types of things as Barnett Newman articulated, this exploration of the spiritual. And I want to share, Morris Louis is another person that I think his work is absolutely fascinating. What Morris Louis would do is he would start with these gigantic canvases, and he would take stains and diluted paint and just pour them. A lot of the times he's displaying these canvases, sometimes upside down, and sometimes right side up from how he poured them. But he's using translucent paint to pour and then doing another color of translucency over it, another color over that. So it feels like, well, what does this kind of feel like to you guys? What does this look like? If it had to be something, what does it look like?
To me, it looks like almost like ceramic glaze, like underlays.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a very different visual texture than you're used to seeing with painting, isn't it? And with these kind of layers, he called them veils. He called them veil paintings, and I can really see that. It feels like some sort of a veil, and I think it's fascinating. And a lot of his paintings deal with this, different layers of translucent paint, very organic shapes. But again, it feels to me like he's sharing a meditation with us as opposed to trying to tell a story or trying to get promote an idea. I think to me, it feels like these are just our meditative explorations. And some of the paintings have very strong colors, and some of them have very pale colors. And some of them, I don't know, it's hard to see exactly what's going on because sometimes the photographers won't photograph the whole thing at one time. Some of them become almost look like candy cane type paintings. Some of them, the colors are transparent and veil-like, but they're poured over each other. Then the canvas is set up tilted this way and that way. Kind of like if you can imagine slow motion drip paintings like Jackson Pollock might do, but with really thin, almost transparent paint. One of his critics complained because the materials that he was using were going to dissolve the canvas, and and they would fall apart, which I think is, if a person is painting specifically to create generational wealth for somebody else, I can see that being a valid complaint. And it is intriguing to me that his take on color field is, again, very different, but still allied to what the other people we looked at were doing. So he also did these drawings, these drawings with dripping paint, sometimes designed to on top of those veils and sometimes underneath them, so that the paint making the veils wouldn't stick to the canvas. So almost like a batik kind of thing. But a lot of his paintings look along these lines, and I think it's really interesting. Trying to get back to share one of his images again, and you can look his work up online, and there's a lot of these large veils that he did that I think were really interesting. Now, what makes this color field is that they're field of color. What makes this distinct is that it was his own take of applying color. Instead of brushing it on, he poured it on. But there's a couple things that I think really unite this philosophically with the other paintings as well. And a big part of that is this feels like a metaphor that he's developed in his own visual language for the same kind of subject matter that Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman and the others were dealing with, which again is having to do with the spiritual. Do you guys see that as well? So I just think it's really fascinating to me. So all these painters were active during the same spread of time, and what we're looking at is between 1946 and mid-60s, which is really interesting because, of course, during that time we have the aftermath of World War II immediately, moving into the Korean War, and then the beginning of the Vietnam War, which I think is interesting. It is fascinating to me that contemporaries, in the 50s, were producing the really frenetic work, while these guys were still being very meditative in their stuff. You know, it's a lot more calm. And then we get into another movement that was called a new sculpture. And this is sculpture right after World War II and through the 50s. That becomes really interesting. So this is British sculpture and painting, and then also Alberto Giacometti and sculpture right after World War II. And we'll look at some of this stuff, but what is fascinating to me about this is these artists are all rather different. They produce different stuff, but there does seem to be a connecting thread between them all. And I want to see if you guys read some of the same kind of stuff that I do when I look at their work. So this is a museum. This is Barbara Hepworth and other works, but this is post-World War II sculpture and several different examples of it. And we can see, well, right here, I think there's a pretty strong connection to what the Bauhaus was doing and, you know, the Russian constructivism. The other stuff, what's interesting to me, what I'm seeing among this kind of stuff is even the figural work, we're not looking at active poses. We're not looking at dynamic forms moving through space. We're looking at people that are at rest or objects that are relatively at rest. And we're looking at, I feel it seems to me that these are more contemplations of forms. And so, you know, looking at these different artists, we don't have, I want to just show you a couple of them that I think are really interesting. Anthony Caro is considered one of the guys that really started off this movement. And his work, you know, like looking at this one, what does that remind you of? What movement? I don't know if you guys are seeing what I'm seeing, but in a lot of this, it reminds me quite a bit of the Bauhaus. You know, some of his work, and I think that that's really interesting, particularly these things. This reminds me quite a bit of that Russian constructivism. Yeah. This reminds me quite a bit of the Bauhaus. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. This reminds me of Russian constructivism. This reminds me of the Bauhaus. What do you guys think of that?
I was going to say that, Andrew. It really reminded me especially of the Russian constructivism because it feels a little bit industrial, but it also feels more like a hopeful, intended utopia of some sort, and different forms of metalwork that can be utilized in different formats towards that Russian constructivist feel.
Well, and I think there's an awful lot to that. One of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating is that a lot of these artists, it feels that same kind of feeling pervades a lot of their works, even though they're very different people. That, and I like what you said, that kind of that hopeful optimism, you know, in their stuff. This is David Smith, and here I think you really start seeing a lot of that kind of utopian optimism that you saw with the Russian constructivism of, you know, a good solid 20 years earlier. And it's the formalism that he uses working with metal. I think it's really interesting. It feels to me philosophically that there's a lot of something connecting it to that kind of meditative space, the kind of calm thinking that I see in a lot of the color field work. But it also reminds me quite a bit of the playfulness of Joe Moreau in his anthropomorphic forms that he was doing quite a bit earlier. I think that these are delicate. I think that they're pretty remarkable. but they don't feel, even though there's lots of little parts, there's lots of little things, it doesn't feel like a frenetic movement that you see in the abstract expressionism. This seems to be more meditative explorations of form more than anything else. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Now, this artist I think is really remarkable, Barbara Hepworth. She explored these organic forms in a very formalistic way, but it feels profound. I mean, it's astonishing to me. It doesn't feel like she's parsing things down to get the most simple shape, like Ikebana or like some of the Bauhaus were really kind of narrowing things down to make it as simple as possible. That's what the Jugendstil was doing. That's what Piet Mondrian was doing. It feels to me like instead of parsing down and taking away, she's finding an ideal form to reflect an ideal thought. Do you know what I mean? Instead of cutting away, she's trying to go right at the heart, you know, and trying to show the heart. I think it's fascinating. But so this is what her artwork, a lot of her artwork looks like this. And I include a video that shares a lot of her in her studio. Let me see if I can, yeah, I'll pull this up and we'll just go through the video. I won't play the video, I'll just show you some of her work. But this very much reminds me of those spirals that we saw in the Russian constructivism. But her work starts, or begins and ends with real powerful explorations of organic forms. She was a sculptor, she was a stonemason, which is not a popular thing for a 1960s lady to do, or 1940s or 1950s lady, but that's what she did. And not only was she a stonemason, but if you look at how she smoothed her forms out, she really knew what she was doing. And she made these beautiful, beautiful shapes that just felt entirely complete. She used stone, she also used wood, she used metal. I think they're remarkable. So here's some action shots of her working with the chisel. And then just look at this form for, you guys can see this, can't you? It's just 2 blocks of material that are incredibly polished, very smooth, but it feels to me like this is completely, well, it's entirely complete. And it gives me the same kind of sense of spiritual awareness as like Mark Rothko kind of painting, where this is all it is. It's not intended to be more, but because of what it is and because of where your eye can go, it becomes almost a solid state meditation. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. What do you guys think about that?
I can't believe how big those pieces were. Like when you first showed it to us, I was like, oh, that's really fun, thinking it was like maybe a foot or two, but to see how huge they were compared to her was kind of incredible.
Yeah, they're like twice the size of a human being. You know, they're gigantic. But when she gets done with something, it feels so balanced. It feels so right. It's otherworldly, I think, is a good way of describing it. And I think it's fascinating.
Just kind of peaceful.
Yeah, very peaceful.
It's interesting because she's working in that type of sculpture. It's usually really masculine. And so for it to have this like really soft, like feminine energy is sort of startling. But they remind me almost of like I think of some of the forms Georgia O'Keeffe painted, but then also
Yeah.
like Stonehenge. Like they feel ancient.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. And I was just trying to, while Joey was talking, I was trying to find a link, and I realized I'd given you guys the wrong link. So I'm going to go back and try to find and edit that out. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. What I've talked about this before, where it seems to me it's harder for an artist to continue their motivation when all they're about is anger. You know, if that's all that they can do, it doesn't seem to go very far. But it's absolutely astounding to me how much is communicated outside of, you know, the fences of words when people are communicating these things like what you guys are resonating with this artwork. And I think it's astounding. What is beautiful to me is that this is what these people decided to do after witnessing 5 million Jews being killed in concentration camps. And they turn around and produce this kind of work. That astounds me. And I think it's really beautiful. Let's see. Okay, I'm editing something really quick here so that it can be ready for you guys. And then we will go to the link. Actually, I'll show you the link right now. Maybe if I can get to it. I'm having a lot of user interface error. Okay, so this guy is considered one of the founders of that post-World War II new sculpture. And I also have a video I wanted to, I don't know, maybe we won't share the video. Okay, here we go. Where Barbara Hepworth was doing very organic and complete forms, Eduardo Chillida is doing things that feel, this doesn't feel blocky to me. Well, it is blocky, but it doesn't feel raw and uncultured. It feels more like the kind of monolithic reverence that you would see with Stonehenge. You know, and which I don't know how on earth you come to that with your sculpture. I mean, how? Because you look at something like this, the 3 irons, and it is essentially just blocks of iron, and that's all it is. And it should be crude. It should feel like, you know, something you'd find as a monument in North Korea. But instead, it feels to me, again, it's resonating that kind of level of meditative introspection. Do you guys sense that too? It astounds me that these artists are able to do this. So I want to share. So, you know, so I think if we go back to this, we can look really briefly. Each of these artists do something very, very different. And so we looked at Anthony Carroll, who seemed to be a blending of Bauhaus and, you know, just raw shape. David Smith, which I think was a little bit more, his sculptures remind me of, oh, who's that Irish poet? Do not go softly into that dark night. Oh, I can't remember his name, but his stuff reminds me of lyrical and almost humorous kind of poetry. And Barbara Hepworth is just sheer simplified beauty. Not simplified and not even rarefied, but just it becomes like almost feels like a standard. You know, these meditative constructions that become standards. And then we get Eduardo Chillida, who is kind of almost a monolithic simplicity that feels again like a meditation. And I think they're amazing. Then we start looking at the avant-garde, and I'd like you guys to explore these. You know, look at these guys and see what you think through them. One of the schools that I thought were really interesting was the Cobra school, and I don't even know what Cobra means, but it's an acronym for something. And they did a lot of stuff that kind of fused that color field sensibility with the freneticism of the abstract expressionists. And then we get this Jean Dubuffet, and his work I think is really interesting. It doesn't bother me nearly as much as Francis Bacon, but it feels to me like it's kind of bridging that space between meditation and freneticism. And some of it just goes all the way over into freneticism. There's a lot of childlike qualities to it. And then some of his more recent work feels quite a bit more psychedelic. And it seems to like open the door for people like Keith Haring. I think it's really interesting. But he's part of this third group that started emerging that kind of reflected ideas of the avant-garde or the advanced garde of thought, where they're trying to push the boundaries of what's okay to think about, what's okay to explore, and not necessarily a bad way. And one of the things that I really like about one of these artists is Alberto Giacometti. Some of his stuff feels very calm, very polished, like Barbara Hepworth, like this. And then others feel like he's almost inviting us to help make it with him. And some of these figural works that he does, like these, make me think of somebody standing right on the edge of the horizon where we can't, oh, I'm sorry, you can't see what I'm seeing. Duh. Okay, here, this is what I was talking about Jean Dubuffet, where this seems to open the door for Keith Haring. And some of his stuff seems to really cross genres between color field and abstract expressionism. I think some of it really kind of bothers me. And then here's Alberto Giacometti. And what I'm talking about is these figural sculptures that he has. What I think of when I look at his work is it seems to me, have you guys, are any of you old enough to remember the Whoopi Goldberg, Patrick Swayze movie Ghost? You guys remember that? Do you remember where you're seeing the spiritual forms and they're so faded out that you basically just see the central column and then everything else kind of fades out? That's the kind, when I look at Giacometti stuff, it almost seems to me like there's a person right on the edge of the horizon and you can only see that concentration in the center, knowing that their form is fading out on either side, which I think is really interesting. And then, so we get a couple of these other guys that are doing, exploring similar ideas. And then we get Yves Klein. He was the first artist, as far as I know, that actually trademarked a color. That's where we get the Klein blue. And he did a lot of really interesting things to explore the tools of paint. But again, he's doing it in a way that makes you think and makes you contemplate, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Here's his Klein. He uses his Klein blue. Once once he trademarked it, he used it for everything he could. And he is the guy who set up glass cases and hired models to go in and paint each other in the walls with the blue that he had created. And I have a friend who just absolutely hates everything he stands for. And I think it's interesting because he's creating at a time when, oh, let's see, we'll do that. He's creating at a time where right post World War II is the first time that you see cosmetic companies market their goods to ordinary people. Before World War II, cosmetics were still seen as the purview of women of the evening, ladies of the night. And post World War II, this is when we see companies coming into existence where their primary goal was to sell cosmetics to women. And what Yves Klein did, in part as a response to that, was set up these events where women became the brushes for the paint, which I think is really interesting because then you start dealing with ideas of demonstrating in a very practical way the objectification of women. And I think that that's really astounding. We're moving away from that meditative aspect that kind of united a lot of these other things, but still he's inviting you to think about it, and I think he opens the door very much so to later conceptual art. And I think it's really interesting. He was also Rosicrucian, which makes me believe that his stuff was not intended specifically to be exploitative. And then, of course, I have to share this with you because I do stained glass. This is Johannes Scheider. And I think we're returning back to that spirituality that we see with the color field painters and the Barbara Hepworth style sculptors. So this is stained glass, but with that very powerful color field sensibility, I believe. And these windows generally are going to be at least 4 feet wide, at least. Some of his larger projects were significantly greater. But he's a German, he's working in Germany. He starts as Germany is being reconstructed post-World War II. And so this is how he chose to deal with knowing about concentration camps, and emerging from war, which I think is really fascinating. What kinds of response do you guys have to this kind of artwork? Brittany, you raised your hand. Yes.
When I look at this, I see the lines as like, like there was something broken, but yet there's a beauty now coming forth despite that, what was broken or what was destroyed.
Yeah, I see that quite a bit too. With the organic nature of the line, I see that quite a bit too. And it's not a fault line, it's not a wound, so much as it is an element to the overall piece. And I think that's one. It's not something that's not supposed to be there. Everything supports that wound, and I think that's a really interesting take on it. And I see the same kind of contemplation that is present with the color field painters. Do you guys see that too? That same kind of meditative restfulness. And that's what I love about these 3 different kind of areas that we looked at. It is a way of addressing hardship and trauma and terrible events that feels to me very cathartic and very healing in a very spiritual and meditative way. And I think it's beautiful. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the visual language, I mean, a lot of times visual artists aren't great with words. That's why they create these languages, you know? And so I feel like everything we're looking at just sort of like is kind of beyond words. Like I can feel it, but it's like hard to sort of grasp what it is. But you know, again, I think it's a powerful language in its own. Like it doesn't need words.
Yeah, and I really like Heidegger. One of the things that he said about language is the moment we choose a word, we choose not to use and separate ourselves from all the other words. You know, so language in the process of communicating something denies communication for so many other things as well. And I think that these artworks, by stepping away from narrative, by really trying to divorce themselves completely from narrative, kind of frees up for that other layer of almost a metaphysical communication. You know, that doesn't have to be fenced in or limited just to language. And I think that that's absolutely fascinating. What boggles my mind is once we see this, we could all of us could probably do something similar for, you know, in the different fields of expertise that we have. But coming up with this visual language to begin with, how do you do that? That blows me away. What kind of presence of mind do you have to be? What kind of maturity do you have to divorce yourself from the traumas that these people have just lived through to create something that's this powerful? I think it's really remarkable to me. All right, well, that's all I have to cover tonight. Any last comments or reflections or really astonishing insights from everybody? I love the fact that you guys were able to bring in the ties to Bauhaus and Soviet or Russian constructivism, because they're very much there. And they're using elements of those vocabulary to create something completely different. And I think that that's really remarkable. But it still relates because it still has that kind of utopian positivity, you know, the kind of hopeful forward thinking. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful weekend. I do want to mention that on Friday, David has invited us to go and visit him at his glass blowing studio, which is right behind Tilted Kiln and Swig, right up there. And we're going to meet in 112 at about 1 o'clock. Then we'll just walk up, you know, that half a block over to where he's at. And he's promised that he's not going to hurt himself or anybody else. And he'll let us know a little bit about what he's doing. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it'll be a lot of fun. All right, folks, you guys have a wonderful week and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a good weekend.
All right, you too.